great pleasure to welcome Mischa Gabowitsch, whom I have met at several memory studies talks across Europe. Really great to have him here virtually at our project. So Mischa Gabowitsch is a historian and sociologist based at the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, Germany. He holds a BA and MA from Oxford and a PhD from the School of Advanced Social Studies in Paris, and is an alumnus fellow of the Princeton University Society of Fellows and past editor-in-chief of the Russian journals NZ and Laboratorium, Russian Review of Social Research. His book publications in English are Protest in Putin's Russia and Replicating Atonement, Foreign Models in the Commemoration of Atrocities. He has also edited several books in Russian and German on war memory and commemoration in Russia and beyond. At present, he is working on a history of Soviet war memorials, as well as a book on Victory Day celebrations since 1945, and also has various projects related to pragmatic sociology, and specifically the sociology of regimes of engagement. So today he'll be talking about some topics from the edited volume, Replicating Atonement, with different types of foreign models and debates about atonement, and then specifically looking at the issue of the German model in post-Soviet commemoration and memorialization regimes. So very pleased to welcome him here and really interested to see where the discussion will lead. So Mischa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margaret. I started the presentation and forgot to unmute myself. So let me restart it now. So thank you very much for the presentation and the introduction. The project that I'm going to talk about today started for me sometime in the mid-2000s. At the time, I was working in Moscow as a journal editor and also organizing and participating in lots of conferences. And I noticed that lots of people, when talking about how Russia is dealing or not dealing with the communist past, and specifically the memory of Stalinist repressions, kept referring to Germany as a sort of ideal model that they thought Russia should emulate. But what I found really striking was that virtually all of the people drawing this comparison were largely ignorant of any specifics of what actually had happened in post-war Germany, and especially West Germany, in relation to dealing with the Nazi past. So it was sort of an idealization of the West German experience, but a very simplistic one, one that usually dispensed with any sort of detail and essentially ended up saying, well, Germany is so great. Germany is the master atoner, and we here in Russia are so terribly behind, and we will never be as good as Germany when it comes to facing our own past. And I found this very puzzling, especially the sort of unproductive implications of this rhetorical figure, because it seemed that people were pointing to an idealized version of the German model without really making any specific suggestions as to what this might mean for Russia in terms of creatively trying to come up with ways of dealing with its own past. And the upshot seemed to be simply that they were the ones who knew how it could be done, but everybody else around them in Russia was really, too primitive intellectually and morally to make the necessary steps. And I found this whole rhetoric extremely puzzling. So I decided to investigate the history of these comparisons and to try and find out where this came from and what really brought about this kind of rhetorical configuration. And as I started thinking about this, I also wanted to put this in a larger international context, because I also noticed that there were similar references elsewhere in debates in lots of other countries. I also found idealized references to the German model, or Germany as the kind of the world champion of atonement. And when I started working on this in the form of a conference and then a project for this edited volume, I thought I would essentially find similar processes everywhere. So a similar kind of rhetoric of idealization. And the task of the volume from the very beginning was very specifically not to compare how different countries deal with their past, because this is something that's really been done ad nauseum. I mean, we've all seen, I guess, dozens of edited volumes where there's one author per country, and we engage in some sort of comparison of how it's done in Argentina, how it's done in Japan, etc. So from the outset, the idea was to look at the ways in which comparisons and analogies are used in debates about how to deal with the past. So in other words, to look at how memory is taken out of context. And that was actually my own title for the book. I wanted to call it Memory Out of Context. And for some reason, the series editor didn't like it. And of course, such comparisons are made with a variety of countries, right? So South Africa often plays a role as an example of a country that had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you'll occasionally find references in debates in other countries to this South African model, with people saying, well, that's what we need, or that's what we don't need. Post-Franco Spain is often referred to as shorthand for a post-dictatorship pact of silence. So often countries stand in for a certain kind of model that's referenced in debates in other countries. But what seems obvious is that Germany, and particularly post-war West Germany, plays an especially prominent role in this. And in the book, this is illustrated, as you can see here, in the book cover, because what you're seeing here is an image of Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, kneeling in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in December 1970. But of course, what is shown here is not the image itself, but it's a later representation, specifically a plaque on a memorial that is now placed in that very spot next to what is now the Jewish Museum in Warsaw, commemorating this act of commemoration. And that to me is, in a sense, symbolic of the way that these references work in a lot of contexts in recent years. And this image in particular, I found very important for this whole topic, because it's one that's constantly used and reused in lots of new geopolitical contexts, and in that sense, taken out of context. So here you see a photo of the original event in December 1970. One context in which this is used all the time is East Asian geopolitical debates about memory. So this, for example, is a tweet by an official Chinese news agency where the supposed lack of repentance and atonement by the then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is contrasted with this gesture of atonement by one of his predecessors. More recently, last year, actually in 2020, the private owner of a botanical garden in South Korea installed this sculptural group in his botanical garden, representing a desired act of atonement, abstractly, as he stressed, not related to anyone in particular, but of course it was very quickly interpreted as a comment on Japanese-Korean relationship and the desire for Japan to make an official apology to the so-called comfort women. Another context in which this image is used quite a lot is the post-Yugoslav one. What's interesting here, this is a snapshot from a trailer of an interview with Tomislav Nikolic, the former president of Serbia, an interview that he gave to a Bosnian TV channel, where he didn't actually perform the gesture of kneeling. He simply discursively said, "I kneel and ask for forgiveness for the crime committed in Srebrenica." And former Yugoslavia is another one of those contexts where the reference to Willy Brandt's gesture, both rhetorically and pictorially, is used again and again. And there's a very interesting forthcoming paper by Jasna Dragović-Soso, where she compares and contrasts two very important metaphors in the Serbian context. One is this reference to Willy Brandt's gesture, with which almost invariably any sort of gesture of atonement in the post-Yugoslav context is contrasted and found failing. And the other is something that you also find in lots of contexts internationally, which is the reference to the Nuremberg trials. And in a lot of different national and international debates, you will again and again find this reference to the Nuremberg trials as a kind of shorthand for a certain type of transitional justice where representatives of a former criminal regime are put on trial. And here, since we are all at least virtually in Estonia, is an example from the Estonian context. So there are, of course, other references to individual elements from what is seen as the German model that are often referenced and usually taken out of context. So, for example, the famous Historikerstreit or historians debate that took part in the second part of the 1980s about sort of West Germany's geopolitical orientation and how that is linked to the way that it deals with the past and how to interpret the National Socialist past. And what I find interesting about this is that if we try to historicize this development, we will see that it's something that is historically relatively recent. So until the 1980s and really into the late 1980s, West Germans were often ostracized internationally and really often met as representatives of a criminal country or a country that had quite recently committed one of the most heinous crimes in history. And one of, even these international reactions to the German debate were often one of the very, very few points where there was something like unanimity in the era of the Cold War. So, for example, in my work on the history of Victory Day in the Soviet tradition, I found that one of the reasons why Victory Day, the 9th of May, was reinstated as a work-free holiday in 1965 was that it was a response to a debate that was happening in West Germany at the time regarding the statute of limitations for crimes committed by Germans during the Nazi period. And this is something to which not only the Soviet Union, the GDR, Socialist Poland, etc., but also Israel, the United States, and West European countries responded very, very forcefully, criticizing the West German government and parliament for not stepping in and extending that statute of limitations. So even the official gestures of atonement that did take place during that period in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s often were due to political and economic pressures exercised in the Cold War context on West Germany. And this is something that West German politicians from that time actually freely admit. So the idea that there was a sort of generalized moral or ethical movement of, dealing with the crimes of the past and sincerely repenting for them is at the very least a very strong simplification. And one of the articles in the book, in a section of personal testimonies or memories, is by Anja Mir, a West German colleague who is slightly older than me and who remembers from a time as an exchange student in the 1980s. Then when she arrived in countries such as the United States or France, very often she was greeted with, quite a large measure of hostility, even though, of course, she had been born well after the end of the war, and really seen as a representative of, post-Nazi Germany, in a sense. And then quite suddenly this changed, and she also talks about that, that starting in the 1990s, when she had already become a professional in the field of transitional justice, she would suddenly be invited to conferences and greeted really as a champion of atonement and a bearer of wisdom simply by virtue of being West German, and someone who might be able to teach other countries how best to deal with a difficult past or a criminal past. So the question is what had happened, and the answer, to simplify things a little bit, is that, of course, the Cold War had ended. and the geopolitical pressures that had kept past atrocities around the world in the closet were perhaps not entirely lifted, but realigned. And the China-Japan relationship is a very good example of that. So in the time of Mao, any sort of radical criticism of Japan, even though Japan, of course, was in a sense a geopolitical enemy as a capitalist country, was sort of kept under a lid because people were supposed to engage in what then was called people's diplomacy, and was not considered politically expedient to engage in sort of overly radical criticism of Japan and sort of reminders of the colonial crimes of Japan during the war. And then that changed quite drastically in the 1990s, when after 1989, the Chinese leadership started using Chinese nationalism as an asset in its own legitimation strategy domestically. And that led to kind of renewed demands towards Japan. And similar processes happened also in the South Korean-Japanese relationship, in North Korean-Japanese relations, and perhaps most importantly in the relationship between the United States and Japan. And one of the most brilliant articles in this collection by Franziska Serafim, a specialist in Japanese studies, analyzes this in really interesting detail. But the other aspect, of course, is that with the loss of the socialist utopia that for a lot of people around the world was still embodied by the Soviet Union, there was a general turn towards the past. And this is something that, of course, we talk about a lot in memory studies, a turn towards the past that, of course, itself is often used today to distract from present-day injustice. So talking about the past became much more important in a lot of countries around the world. So taken together, this constituted a set of pull factors that made people in lots of different national and regional contexts much more interested in finding something that could work as a model or a reference. And very often they found this model in what they thought had happened in West Germany. In addition, of course, there were push factors. And the most important among these is Germany's dense and well-funded network of political foundations, memorials, associations, etc., dealing with the Nazi past, but now increasingly also with the communist past in East Germany. And these organizations end up advertising German efforts through their sheer presence in the international mnemonic landscape, even when they themselves, the people who work there, very earnestly point to the limitations of using the German model as an exemplar. So simply through, the sheer number of events sponsored and funded and organized by these German associations, so many people from all over the world become familiarized with at least some aspects of what they then perceive as the German model, that this is very much on a lot of people's minds. So in the book, we tried to look at this through a series of case studies from a number of different countries. And here you see the table of contents, and you'll see that there are lots of different regions of the world represented. And then as I read through the different case studies contributed from practitioners of different disciplines interested in different periods, I tried to pull them together and establish something like a typology. And in the process of doing that, I realized that the case with which I had started in my own research, namely the late Soviet and post-Soviet case, really in a sense was a bit of an outlier. And my initial hunch that we would find more or less similar things elsewhere was really in a sense off the mark, and things were at least a little bit more complicated. So based on these different case studies, which I don't have the time to summarize individually, I came up with this four-part typology of how references to the German model, but sometimes also other international models, tend to be used in debates about how to deal with a difficult past. So the first way of doing this is what I call the springboard. And this is essentially when people look at what happened in some country, let's say, West Germany, spent some time studying the complexity, the historical context of what it was that actually happened there, how debates about the past unfolded, what sort of transitional justice measures may have been implemented. And then they tried to adapt that to their own national context, thinking through the complexities and the differences between the original model and what they are facing. And then in the end, coming up with a solution that is specifically adapted to their own problem, but which ideally draws on some elements from a foreign model, or probably several. So this is, in a sense, what maybe ideally should happen. And in the book, this is represented by a number of case studies, specifically on Canada and the United States. And one that may be of particular interest because it is documented in the book in the form of an essay, but has now also been turned into a best-selling book by the director of the Einstein Forum, where I work, Susan Neiman, is a study of how the West German experience of dealing with the Nazi past is perceived and understood and adapted by those in the United States, and specifically the US South, trying to deal with the legacy of slavery. And what Susan writes about in her essay is primarily how people in anti-racist associations and in commemorative associations in, for example, Mississippi, are inspired when they learn that the process in West Germany was not as smooth as maybe they had imagined, but on the contrary had run into lots of difficulties and obstacles along the way. And this kind of inspires them to persevere and come up with their own ideas, despite the obstacles that they themselves face. Another model is what I call the yardstick. And this is when the experience of one country or several countries is, in a sense, abstracted from and turned into a set of formalized rules or a toolkit that people then expect other countries to implement. And once again, the essay that deals with this perhaps most explicitly in our book has now been turned into a book in its own right by the sociologist Leah David, whose book is called The Past Can't Heal Us. And she uses case studies from the Israeli-Palestinian context and also from former Yugoslavia to argue that in these cases, what often happens is that there's a lot of pressure from international organizations for these countries to implement certain standardized models of remembrance, often derived from cosmopolitan Holocaust remembrance, which end up playing a counterproductive role in these contexts, because instead of being sources of creative ways of dealing with the trauma that people are actually facing in these countries, they become a pressure that is exercised, and then people try to kind of find ways around it. And what they often do is that they tick all the right boxes, they write all the right reports for the international organizations, but then what actually happens on the ground can run counter to the spirit of what these rules were actually supposed to achieve. And she shows how specifically in post-Yugoslav Serbia and Croatia, national politicians have become extremely adept at writing exactly the kinds of reports that international organizations such as the EU expect from them, but then also at the same time funding nationalist commemorative projects in the forms of publications, memorials for ultranationalist politicians from these countries. The third model is what I call the foil, and I will get to that in some more detail later, because that is what I find the Soviet and post-Soviet case to correspond with most closely. And the foil is essentially when people refer to the experience of some other country without any interest at all in the detail of that experience, simply as a kind of rhetorical device to better put in relief certain features of what happens in their own country that they find, particularly worthy of critique, right? So people in Russia saying, well, look at how good Germany is at atoning, and we will never get there without really understanding any of the sort of complexity and historical detail of what happened in Germany. And a fourth model is what I call the screen. And this is described perhaps most elegantly in a chapter by Małgorzata Wosińska, who is a trained psychoanalyst who worked at the Auschwitz Memorial in Poland for several years, but then also worked as an ethnographer in Rwanda. And she was struck by the fact that a lot of people that she met in Rwanda immediately recognized references to Auschwitz and the Holocaust, even recognizing an image on the cover of a book she was reading while waiting for a bus somewhere in rural Rwanda that showed the Auschwitz concentration camp, while at the same time denying that there were any traces or remnants of Rwanda's own genocide, even though she was at that very same time working on extremely visible traces, such as thousands of unburied bodies of genocide victims. And she interprets this as a kind of screen memory where it is so difficult and traumatic for people to talk about what actually happened quite recently in their own country that they find it much more unproblematic, much easier to constantly slip into references to other crimes that happened in other world regions and to the ways that other countries, but not their own, have dealt with these problems. So this is just a very, very schematic overview of the book and of my introduction. And now let me use the remainder of my time to talk also somewhat schematically about my chapter, which deals with the Soviet and post-Soviet case. So what I'm going to propose to you is a sort of series of vignettes, each of them tied to a particular decade, about how West German efforts of dealing with the Nazi past kind of trickled through the Iron Curtain into the Soviet Union, and how they created certain unexpected and very complex and tenuous entanglements, influencing the ways in which some members of what I here call the liberal Soviet intelligentsia thought about how to deal with the Soviet past. So why is this of interest? One of the main interesting points here, if we put the Soviet case in international context, is that globally interest in the German model is usually tied to cosmopolitan Holocaust memory, right? So references to how well Germany dealt with its crimes usually imply that the crimes we're talking about are primarily the Holocaust. This is not at all the case in the Soviet Union and in post-Soviet Russia. And what is intriguing here, in fact, is that until today, the Holocaust actually plays a secondary role in the imagination that most people in Russia have of what actually constituted Nazi crimes. So the main crime from a kind of Soviet and post-Soviet point of view was not so much the extermination of Jews as a separately defined ethnic group, but it was the attack on the Soviet Union. And that is what made the National Socialist system so evil, so vile, and the most important enemy of the Soviet Union. So in a sense, this is an atypical case, internationally speaking. So this shows that Holocaust remembrance is not a necessary condition for these kinds of references to the German model to work. And what I found in all of these vignettes that I'm going to show you is that throughout this debate, starting in the 1960s and to this day, Germany has always acted as this kind of foil onto which people projected positions that they wanted to occupy in internal Soviet and Russian debates. So interest in what actually happened in Germany was always rather circumscribed, and it was always kind of a language used to talk about Stalinist repressions or the Soviet past in general. So let me start with the 1960s very briefly. The tone for the very first attempts to make this comparison was set, I would argue, by the writer Vasily Grossman, who of course was a war correspondent, a member of the famous Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and the author in the 1950s of a novel that would become later world famous when it was eventually published, Life and Fate, which was an attempt, in a sense, at a sort of Tolstoy-style panorama of the war, where he depicted both the Soviet and the Nazi side. And if you read, or I'm assuming reread the novel, you will see that while his descriptions of Soviet officers and generally the Soviet side of things are usually spot on, his descriptions of what happened on the German side, while very, very interesting and sophisticated in many ways, sometimes read also like a projection of things that he had experienced in the Soviet Union. Grossman was not really an expert on Germany, so for him, this comparison was really a way to bring out similarities between a system that everyone agreed was totalitarian and a system that nobody was allowed to call totalitarian. And subsequent attempts to draw a comparison, in a sense, followed that model. And two of these attempts I find particularly interesting. One was a documentary film made in the 1960s called Ordinary Fascism. And this was made from mostly archival footage that Soviet filmmakers had access to, primarily in the East German archives, but also in some trophy archives that ended up in Moscow, and which Mikhail Roma, a legendary and famous Soviet filmmaker and a very important figure in kind of early Soviet propaganda, used to compile this very powerful documentary about Hitler's rise, the rise of the Nazi Party, and the sort of rise and fall of the National Socialist system. And what makes this film particularly interesting in my context is that it worked on two levels. So it was seen in the Soviet Union by roughly 20 million people. And one of the reasons why it had such a large appeal was that it was the first time that ordinary Soviet citizens actually got to see Hitler on screen. Right? It was the first film that actually showed footage, and lots of footage, of Nazi leaders, and kind of gave people a visual impression of this regime, while, of course, more or less strictly following rhetorically the official sort of line of interpretation of what fascism was. So, for example, the word Jew is only uttered once in the entire film. But then on another level, which was, if we are to believe their memoirs, very much on the mind of the authors of the screenplay, was that they were already thinking about this comparison, and that the way the film was put together was supposed to suggest this comparison between the totalitarian German system and the recent Stalinist past in the Soviet Union. And what's interesting is that the two levels worked for different audiences. So it would be a vast exaggeration to assume that every one of the 20 million people who viewed the film was sort of became immediately aware of these hidden references. But we know, and not only from memoirs, that the references were certainly obvious to at least a certain kind of liberal, often Jewish, educated intelligentsia in the larger cities. And one interesting piece of evidence is this sort of self-made samizdat film that was made by a couple of dissidents soon after the film came out, a few years after the film came out, which they called An Ordinary Cult, which followed the sort of montage principles of ordinary fascism, but indicting the Soviet system. Another really extremely fascinating example is the story behind the creation of the first and only Hitler biography ever produced in the Soviet Union. This is a book that was written in the 1960s by a married couple, Daniil Melnikov, a pseudonym, a well-known journalist and spokesperson for sort of the Soviet regime, someone who had grown up in Berlin and spoke excellent German, and his wife, Lyudmila Chornaya, who is still alive at the age of, I believe, 104, and was a well-known translator of German literature. And this is a book that eventually was published in 1981 and then translated into a number of Soviet languages. But when it was initially written in the 1960s, its publication was sort of delayed, and it was banned from publication in both the journal and book version for a complicated set of reasons that I can't go into right now. But what's interesting for my purposes here is the context in which the text was written. So Melnikov, due to his relatively privileged position, was able to travel to West Germany. And when he mentioned there that he was working on, or he was interested in working on a biography of Hitler, Heinrich Böll, the West German writer, some of whose books Chornaya had translated, ended up sending them a crate of books. Or at least that's how Chornaya describes it in her memoirs. So she says that, and we're talking here about sometime in the early to mid 1960s, he literally mailed a crate of books in German by post to their address in Moscow, containing studies by German historians or by international historians in German translation, that kind of were some of the earliest products of the debate in West Germany about the sort of historiography, but also the moral implications of the recent Nazi past. And the couple then drew on those books to write their biography of Hitler, which in a sense, I mean, if you read it today, it reads extremely bland, and one might even be forgiven for sort of not understanding what was supposed to be so subversive about it. But of course, the very format of a biography, rather than a sort of class-based traditional Marxist analysis, was something that was not entirely kosher by the standards of the time. And they also built kind of implicit Aesopian references to possible parallels that might be drawn between the Nazi and the Soviet system into their book. And once again, one has to be very careful with this and not to simply believe kind of retrospective memoirs when people write in the post-Soviet period that everything that they produced in the 60s and 70s had this sort of Aesopian thrust. But once again, we do have archival evidence that these references were understood by people at the time, and that is, of course, one of the reasons why, at least initially, the book could not be published. So yet another example, very briefly, is this famous play by Peter Weiss, the West German communist playwright, based on the Auschwitz trial of 1963 to 1966. Which is a piece of what we would now call documentary theater, and which was quite interesting in that its premiere happened simultaneously in both West and East Germany, and soon after that it was also staged at the legendary Taganka Theater in Moscow by Pyotr Fomenko, a then very kind of young and promising theater director. And once again, we know that this production and other productions at the Taganka Theater at the time were interpreted by at least some in the audience and by at least some censors as sort of veiled references to possible parallels between the two systems. But what's interesting in all of these cases is that it would be too simplistic to say that we're talking about a group of sort of courageous liberals who were sort of trying to probe the limits of what could be said at the time and drawing explicit attention to parallels between two totalitarian regimes, because if we had time to go into the details of what actually happened in all of these cases, Life and Fate, the investigation by Peter Weiss, but also Criminal Number One, the Hitler biography, we could see that the reason why ultimately all of these things could not be published, or the production was axed, etc., often had to do with sort of institutional micropolitics or individual rivalries. But basically, the upshot is that in the 1960s there was this wave of what we might call Aesopian fascism, where people talked about fascism, which was kind of a recognized symbol of evil, in order to make a very tentative point about the Soviet system. And of course, there are very clear and strict limitations to what can be said in that kind of framework. Another interesting point about this is that many of the people who were involved in these early attempts were very much part of the Soviet elite. So Mikhail Rom, the director, as I mentioned, was one of the most influential and celebrated members of the sort of Soviet propaganda apparatus. Melnikov, the co-author of the Hitler biography, even after this book was axed, continued to travel freely to West Germany until their son, the famous Soc art artist Milamid, which is, by the way, Melnikov's original last name, emigrated, and that's when Melnikov was banned from any further international travel. So these were people who were very much aware of what was possible and what wasn't, and they were very much part of the elite. In contrast, in the 1970s, there was a wave of discussion that happened in samizdat circles and among dissidents who were much more on the margins of Soviet intellectual and cultural life. And just as an example, I want to cite here a really interesting debate that took place over a number of years between Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whom of course most of you will know as the Nobel Prize-winning author of the Gulag Archipelago, and another very interesting dissident and samizdat author, Grigory Pomerantz. Both of them had spent time in Stalinist labor camps, and both of them were very keenly interested in the question of moral responsibility for the past and atonement and repentance. And this really marks a break with the 1960s, because if these sort of Aesopian attempts to talk about fascism and communism, they were really about indicting the system. There was no real discussion of any sort of responsibility, let alone individual responsibility for the crimes of the past. Now, in the 1970s, in these samizdat debates, really that question was put on the agenda. And I'm not going to read out the long quotes, but what's interesting is that Solzhenitsyn, in an essay that he wrote before leaving the Soviet Union, and which was published then soon after he was exiled, spoke very admiringly of Willy Brandt's gesture. And even though generally he considered West German policies to be naive, he thought that they were evidence of a truly ethical position and therefore exemplary. Now, Solzhenitsyn, of course, spoke no German, so he had no firsthand knowledge of German politics. But from what he learned about this, he thought that this was really an interesting and exemplary case of moral behavior in politics. And in his essay, he developed the idea that atonement is a competition between nations. So it's very important to be better at atoning than the others. And that the Russians have, based on their history and culture, a natural propensity for atonement, and therefore, in a sense, will excel at this, and they will win this contest once they truly engage in it. He also thought that every nation has something to atone for. So he writes that, of course, Russians must apologize, for example, to the Poles for Stalinist repressions and killing so many of them and sending them to labor camps, and also the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. But then the Poles also need to apologize to the Russians for occupying part of Russia in the 17th century and for destroying Orthodox churches in the 1930s. So essentially the upshot of that position, the sort of national reading of atonement, was that every nation has something that it's guilty of, and there is ultimately no hierarchy of crimes. So everyone needs to atone. Now, I don't want to sort of ridicule his position, even though you may sense that I find a lot of it problematic. There was a lot in it that was very prescient. So he advocated, for example, the idea that nations need to engage in self-limitation in multiple ways, not least to avert ecological catastrophe, because the sort of thinking focused on technological progress that he thought, in a sense, had led to totalitarianism might also lead to ecological catastrophe. But of course, his position was also very strongly nationalistic and sometimes even had racist undertones when, for example, he criticized the British government for letting so many Africans and West Indians into the country. Now, Grigory Pomerantz, when he responded to Solzhenitsyn, he questioned the idea that ethno-national communities are the only possible subject of atonement. And Pomerantz was really interesting because, unlike Solzhenitsyn, he was an extremely well-read and polyglot scholar. He was originally a scholar of Buddhism, who, not least due to his position as a librarian, had access to a lot of international literature and thus firsthand knowledge of debates in many other countries. And one of his points was that it's not necessarily nations that can atone, and that in fact the Czech communists, referring to, of course, the Prague Spring of 1968, were much more sort of authentically repentant than the West Germans, not least because they didn't repent and atone out of the same geopolitical pressures that West Germany was facing in a Cold War context. Pomerantz also, in his reply to Solzhenitsyn, anticipated one of the problems with the West German debate that really wouldn't be kind of put on the agenda in Germany until, I would say, the 2000s, namely that repentance in the name of an ethno-national community presupposes the ethnic purity of the repenter, and thus excludes those with immigrant backgrounds. And this is something that, of course, right now is being very hotly debated in Germany, as, of course, a lot of the much celebrated sort of German culture of remembrance and atonement was premised on the idea that the Germans of today are the biological descendants of the Nazi Germans, and it is this sort of biological link to their parents and grandparents that, in a sense, makes them still responsible for past crimes. And Germans of, let's say, Turkish or Yugoslav or Soviet immigrant background simply have no place at all in these debates. They are outsiders and should just essentially keep their mouths shut. And this is a problem that very much Pomerantz anticipated in his sort of contrast between nations and, for example, political parties or other subjects of repentance. Once again, since time is running out, I can't delve more into this, and I want to jump straight into the 1980s with perestroika and also kind of spilling over into post-Soviet debates. What's interesting during perestroika was that, of course, debates about the Stalinist past were one of the main topics that were put on the agenda during the period of glasnost, especially starting in 1987. There were huge debates whose audience, due to the circulation numbers of Soviet newspapers and journals at the time, was probably much larger than even anything that West Germany ever witnessed. There were a few comparisons with West Germany that kept kind of cropping up in these debates. And I like to compare these comparisons, if I may, with what is probably my favorite Soviet joke, which I think is a sort of wonderful contribution to the sociology of knowledge under conditions of the Iron Curtain. It's a joke about group sex, where the question is, what is group sex Swedish style? It's obviously 10 people getting together and having sex. What is group sex French style? It's 10 people getting together and shooting a film about the Swedes. What is group sex Polish style? It's 10 people getting together and watching a bootleg copy of that film in someone's apartment. And group sex Soviet style, obviously, is 10 people getting together in the kitchen and listening to someone whose stepmother went to Poland and talked to someone whose friend saw that bootleg film, right? So references to what was happening in West Germany at the time, specifically the historians' debate and other important debates, essentially followed that model. What is fascinating is that I really tried systematically to look for any sort of coverage in Soviet periodicals of the historians' debate, and I found, I think, 2 or 3 publications, none of which really gave people an idea of what the debate was actually about. So there was no way of actually knowing the content, and yet in many of the debates that started taking place in the Soviet Union at the time, these references to these great and very sophisticated discussions in West Germany took center stage and were combined with kind of renewed interest in all of these products of the 1960s. So ordinary fascism, the Hitler biography, Solzhenitsyn's texts were quoted again and again. And in addition, there was this idea that we need a new Nuremberg, once again, often without really spelling out exactly what that would mean. And when there was an attempt in the early post-Soviet period in the 1990s to actually organize a ban of the Communist Party, we know from interviews with some of the people in Boris Yeltsin's presidential administration at the time that this idea of having a Nuremberg trial over the Communist Party was very much on their mind. So what I find fascinating about this historical moment is that even though some of the discussions taking place at the same time about the new discoveries about Stalinist repressions and the moral implications were actually extremely sophisticated. And if you reread them today, I would say that they were, in no way more primitive than what was happening in Germany. There was this very strong sense of inferiority among many participants in the debate, and constant references to this wonderful way in which Germany supposedly had dealt with their own difficult past, and how Soviet and post-Soviet Russia would never get there. And this was then kind of continued in the early 90s, and this is illustrated by this quote that I'm displaying here by Jan Plumper, who then went on to become a famous historian of the Soviet Union, where German and almost exclusively West German historians started going to Russia to participate in roundtable discussions, etc., and really in many ways acted in almost colonial fashion as purveyors of an ideal solution to how one can and cannot engage in historical comparison, how one is supposed to deal with difficult past, with really interesting kind of miscommunications taking place with their Russian colleagues. Now, without going into this in great detail, what is striking, if you follow these discussions and the whole literature really into the present day, is that this sort of almost fetishistic use of references to the supposedly ideal German model continue until this day. So, whenever someone who has not really dealt with these issues before wants to make a point about how Russia is failing at dealing with its past, almost invariably they will refer to something that they've heard about, how great the Germans were. And usually it will be, Nuremberg or the historians' debate, or maybe the famous book by the social psychologist, the Mitchell list from the 1960s. And also almost invariably, these points will be made by people who have really a very faint idea at best of the historical complexity and the political context in which all of these contributions were actually taking place in West German history. And I would argue that until very recently, this has actually had almost a kind of freezing effect or a chilling effect on the search for creative ways of dealing with the Stalinist and Soviet past in Russia, because most such debates would simply end in this comparison where it would be clear that, you know, Germany is great at atoning, Russia is bad, and that's essentially the end of it. And it's only relatively recently that one can find more creative approaches of looking specifically at the complexity of some German contributions and going into the direction of what at the beginning of the talk I called the springboard model, and namely thinking about how this can be meaningfully adapted to a Russian context. And I want to mention only two examples. One is the topography of terror, which in the German case, of course, is a memorial in central Berlin at the site of the former Reich Security main office that was essentially the headquarters of planning, organizing, and implementing the Holocaust, among other things, and which was based on initially on an initiative by a civil society association, but which in the Russian case in Moscow, but now also in certain other cities, has been kind of adapted and transformed into a digital map and a series of, for example, guided tours that cover a much larger array of sites, because of course, unlike the case of Berlin, in the case of the NKVD terror in Moscow in the 1930s and later, there was a much broader geography of sites of torture, imprisonment, and extermination, and it simply wouldn't work to simply transfer the German model one-on-one to the Russian case. So this is one case of a really interesting and creative adaptation. Another, perhaps even more interesting case is how the famous stumbling stones invented by the German artist Gunther Demnig, which are brass kind of plaques placed in the sidewalk, usually in front of houses where people lived before they were deported to concentration camps and extermination camps, how that was adapted in Russia, namely in the form of these metal plaques called the last address, which are placed not in the sidewalk because, I mean, not least due to climatic conditions and also urban planning conditions in Russia that would be less practical, but they're placed on the walls of the buildings from which people were deported, usually at the height of the Stalinist terror. So once again, this is a case of people kind of taking an interesting example from the German context and, you know, not simply lamenting the fact that there's nothing like it in Russia, but actually taking some time to creatively think about how this can be adapted. So to conclude this really very kind of cursory look at the Soviet and Russian case, I would argue that what we have is a continued relevance of what I've called the foil model, with these ultimately unproductive references to supposedly ideal German model, but then increasingly in recent years, some movement towards what could be called a springboard model, where people draw actual inspiration from something that was invented in Germany, but can be used in adapted form in the Russian context. And my hope is that despite, of course, the continuing onslaught on memory activism in Russia today, we will see more such examples in the future. Many thanks for your attention. I know that I took a very long time for this, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can put the applause thing on. There we go. For this amazing talk. Really enjoyed it. In my own work, part of the reason I wrote my PhD dissertation on different models of memorialization of victims of Soviet repression was because I felt that the German models really didn't, capture the complexities of what happened in the Soviet Union, particularly the changing categories of victim and perpetrator over time. So really enjoyed a lot of what you said. I have plenty of questions, but does anyone have something they want to start off with? Or if not, I can begin. So, okay, Mischa Twitchin has a question.
Hello. We last saw each other in
Good
Madrid.
to see you, Mischa. Yeah.
Yes. It's just a quick for you to maybe discuss a bit further, because I perhaps misunderstood. But the terms of my misunderstanding are that maybe in a way how the foil model becomes complicated and sort of a palimpsest of the screen model, with the reference to Nuremberg. Because in a way, Nuremberg was not a case of German atonement. It was something that was felt in Germany to have been imposed by, victor's justice, and the whole question of retrospective prosecution in a different legal context following the end of the war, and it being the last, well, in a sense, that a final gesture of potential cooperation between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, but already, as we know, during the course of Nuremberg, that breaking apart into what the Cold War conflict. So it sort of seems sort of curious, as I said, how it would register in your various typology in the post-Soviet context.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's fascinating to me that when people talk about Nuremberg as something that they would like to replicate, usually not only are the historical details blurred regarding, for example, which Nuremberg trials they're actually talking about, but perhaps more importantly, the question of agency is blurred. So you'll find a lot of texts where it almost seems as if there was kind of a seamless transition or complex from Nuremberg to denazification, and also including, books such as The Question of German Guilt by Karl Jaspers. And it's almost presented as if, all of that was part of some sort of German effort to come to terms with German guilt. And, I'm not going into all the different ways in which this is problematic. But what's interesting is that some people have actually kind of, taken this logic to the extreme. And in the 1990s in particular, there were a few kind of radical opposition figures in Russia who actually said that they would welcome a NATO occupation of Russia in order for there to be a Nuremberg trial of the Communist Party. I mean, those were, even at the time, usually considered, kind of almost parts of the lunatic fringe. But there were such statements. But often enough, there's no clear understanding of who should actually organize the Nuremberg trial, and it's simply used as a shorthand for there were people who committed crimes, and we should punish them. So that's it.
It's interesting that I mean my association with the word screen is more with the Freudian idea of a screen memory, and so but exactly how that then functions in the repeated word, even on the lunatic. What does the lunatic fringe present a symptom of that's nevertheless true? And perhaps it's in the word you then repeated again was occupation, and the way in which the allusion to Nuremberg is a form of screen memory about the dynamics of occupation between the Soviet Union and Germany, and of course the division of Germany.
That's an interesting point. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, what I have noticed is that I think it's a symptom of a certain kind of expectation on the part of even a lot of, kind of good liberal memory activists who are critical of the, insufficient critique of the Soviet past, etc., that ultimately it's the state that has to atone, right? So I even tried a few times to organize sort of informal polls among, my networks in Russia of, okay, so you keep talking about what isn't working in the current way of dealing with the past, but how would you go about changing it? And what do you think should happen? And in 90% of cases, the answer is, well, the state should, right? The state should apologize, the state should atone, the state should stop doing this or that. And there's no clear understanding of, how do we get there? So the whole history, which was extremely important in the West German context of grassroots organizations and grassroots circles, actually, fighting for decades to, gain access to documents or to, erect memorials, et cetera, and, putting a huge deal of pressure on the state and to the point of even deliberately joining state agencies in order to change them from within. That's kind of excluded from the discussion. And instead, people just say, well, the way the state is doing this now is terrible, and the state should do this or that. And I think that these repeated references to Nuremberg are very much a symptom of that. It's the idea that, some kind of deus ex machina, some benevolent agency should step in from the top and just, civilize us and punish the criminals and kind of shift us almost overnight from a situation of moral guilt to kind of, renewed innocence or responsibility or something like that.
Interesting. That's a really kind of interesting point to make, because I was thinking as you were finishing your presentation and talking about It Is Right Here, or the Topography of Terror, and Last Address, that those are run by these NGOs who, and in the case of Memorial and It Is Right Here, are under terrible pressure, possibly of extermination, right, by the government right now. So it is the case, weirdly enough, in Russia, that it's these NGOs and civil society organizations that are leading the charge to memorialize this past. But I wanted to ask about one aspect kind of tied to that, which is the memorialization of individual victims, which is a major part, right, of both Last Address and some of Memorial's initiatives, right, is bringing back names, listing names publicly or in these publicly commemorative events. And it's one of the, I guess, assertions of my work that this is, a really valuable thing for people to do. But if it's in certain political or social conditions, it's a way to remember the past without dealing with bringing responsibility or discussions of particularly contemporary responsibility that might be inherited or might be institutional into the conversation. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that type of focusing on, the individual victims as opposed to conversations about accountability and responsibility.
Yeah, that's a very important point. So let me start by saying that I want to be careful and stress that what I said was not a critique of the existing memory activist associations in Russia, Memorial specifically, but also others. In fact, I think one of the problems is that the kinds of sort of foil discourses that I talked about tend to distract from the very real efforts that people have actually made, since the 1980s, including the debates about Stalinism happening at the time, and tend to kind of belittle what is actually being done in Russia by constantly saying, well, but it's not the same as in Germany, so it doesn't count. Having said that, I do want to say that even among some people in Memorial, I have witnessed this kind of, desire for the state in particular to engage in certain kind of top-down commemorative acts. And I remember specifically, I was there in Moscow when the competition was held for the Gulag Memorial that von Gulian's kind of entry ended up winning. And the late Arseny Roginsky was the head of the memorial at the time, really stressed in his speech that it was extremely important for him that it's a state memorial. It's not just a memorial kind of organized and brought into being by an independent association, but it's something that has a kind of stamp of approval of the state, even though that might mean a certain number of kind of compromises. But it was extremely important, certainly for the first generation of Memorial, not only to engage in this grassroots memorialization, but also to involve the state. So it's the kind of the boundary here is somewhat blurred. But to get to your actual point, what I find fascinating, and as you know, I also work quite a lot on war memory in Soviet and post-Soviet context, is that this is really part of a general tendency. And there's actually a wonderful edited volume that came out, I think 10 years ago, maybe in German, where the authors looked at the kind of longue durée history of the commemoration of fallen soldiers all over the world, from Chile to China. And they found that the one common feature in all of these countries, if you look at the history from the 19th century until today, was increasing individualization of commemoration, right? So from commemorating only generals and princes and kings, etc., eventually we got to a point where, even in countries that don't have this kind of tradition, Iraq was another example, we now have a very individualized commemoration in the form of names. And I tried in one of my papers to develop this further and to argue that from individualization, by now we have reached the stage of personalization, where if you take a list of names, that is essentially still commemoration from the point of view of the state, because all the information that it includes is information that's relevant to the state. First name, last name, rank, date of birth and death. Whereas what we increasingly see now, and that goes for the commemoration of the victims of Stalinism, just as much as for war participants, is that people want to tell a story, right? And this has been described in the British context, for example, for British soldiers who died in Afghanistan, but it's something that we find all over the world, is that it's no longer enough to just have a list of names and to call that individual commemoration. We now need to know more about the person. And it's very characteristic, I think, that for war commemoration, we have the Immortal Regiment, which of course is not just a parade of people with portraits of their relatives, but it's also perhaps just as importantly a website where people post biographies and reminiscences and things that they know about the person. And this also shows that there's a really interesting kind of resonance and mutually fruitful, but also complex and contradictory relationship between different types of commemoration. So, for example, war commemoration, as you very well know, and Gulag commemoration kind of influence each other, because even though we already had all these practices that Memorial came up with, like the 30th of October, reading out lists of names, etc., after the Immortal Regiment was launched, someone came up with this idea for the Immortal Barracks, which is kind of very much modeled on the Immortal Regiment, and which by now a lot of people also engage in. So what this shows, once again, is that you cannot take Gulag commemoration, the commemoration of the victims of repressions, completely out of context and simply compare it to, let's say an idealized German model or something else. You always need to consider it in its own historical context. And the historical context that we have now in a number of post-Soviet countries, not limited to Russia, is that most of the people who engage in it are members of the grandchildren's generation. And we know from memory studies the world over that there's a very particular dynamic between grandchildren and grandparents, and also that there's a much more complex relationship between war memory and Gulag memory than people would have us believe when they advocate kind of clearly separating. I mean, there's this idea that war memory has acted as a kind of battering ram against the return of the memory of the repressed. So by constantly repeating how great the victory was, etc., kind of, repressing the memory of repression. And I think that argument doesn't really work, because what you very often see is that, the same people engage in both, and they do so in ways that might strike many of us as kind of, surprising, unexpected, and sometimes even bizarre. But there is kind of a mutual influence between these two things. So I think it's very dangerous to try and sanitize this and to simply take, the kind of memory content that happens to be of interest to us and, measure it against the yardstick of what happened in some other country in some other period. Instead, we always need to at least try and take a more kind of holistic societal approach and see what processes are happening in society that have an impact on the way that commemoration works.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. Does anybody else have a question? Because I do have another one, obviously.
Yes, maybe I will try to formulate one, as I have many ideas. So thank you so much for this great talk, and also bringing this Soviet material about the parallels between German model and also the Estonian examples. By the way, I just checked now in the library catalog and the book about number one perpetrator. Yes, was actually only 85 published in Estonian. So I don't know what's the original.
81.
Okay, so not such a delay then, but I thought that maybe even longer. So yes, I mean, hugely interesting this idea of comparison and maybe the first thing I would ask is, to what extent how do you relate this work to Rothberg's idea of multidirectional memory, which also deals with comparisons, but also maybe the question of these implicit parallels, because obviously you deal with like it's kind of discourse analysis, I guess, where you look at what kind of parallels have been drawn. What we have seen in our project, and this was something partly that inspired the whole project, was this idea of the memorial forms that are borrowed, that are like foreign models, but they are kind of implemented implicitly, that it's not explicitly said, and this can happen obviously in it's specific to aesthetic media of memory, like in a novel or in a film, you use a memorial form or a template, a narrative template that comes, so many of them come from a cosmopolitan Holocaust memory, then to tell the story about the Stalinist repressions. And this was actually the initial inspiration for the project, that some, like Sophie Oksonen's novel Purge, for example, using, in that case, not the Holocaust, but actually the trope of war rape as a like internationally known memorial form to talk about Stalinist repression. So to what extent you also looked at, like, or is there something like an implicit comparison in this material you're working with? And my second question is about this normativity, because I really liked your typology, because and then some of the chapters in the book, Lea David and the others, are clearly very critical of this norm, because what you call idealization in a Russian debate is actually like the other side of this normativity that comes from outside. And I think we have also struggled with with this question of normativity, that we're currently editing a special issue for Slavic and Eastern European studies on collaboration and perpetration, like the models how to deal with collaboration and perpetration, and we have several contributions about memorial museums in Central Eastern Europe, and there is always like the way they have been dealt with is also in terms of research is quite normative. They are always found lacking in some sense. So if you have any ideas about maybe about the normativity in our own research, also not only in these debates you study. I mean, very very vague questions and very long and non-concise. But if you have something on these issues,
no, these are very much themes that also kind of accompanied me throughout the many years that I was thinking about this, and the project was very, very long in the making. Maybe let me start with the last point about normativity. I mean, one of the impulses for me to place this in larger international context and to really start thinking systematically about sort of Germany as the master atoner was when I was listening to a radio interview on some German language radio station about the Jasenovac memorial in Croatia, where they were interviewing some German expert on memorials who was, very unapologetically saying, well, these Croatians, they don't really do things to our German memorialization standards. And I was really struck by this and by the sort of the lack of, self-critical reflexivity when you have, a German who appears so proud of having developed, the right kind of industrial norm for how to deal with past crimes without any regard for the differences in historical context of what is being commemorated, but perhaps most importantly, the differences in the political context of what can be commemorated in Croatia, let's say 10 years ago, compared to Germany at the same time, right? So that was when I really started looking more at the German side of things and at how sometimes this is done very explicitly, as in the Plumper quote that I gave in the talk. But even when people try to be aware of these problems, even when they kind of go to another country and say, by no means should you emulate Germany, and there are still a lot of things wrong with how we do things in Germany, etc. Simply based on the kind of the structural conditions in which this is happening, there's still a very strong imbalance. So what I ended up with, and I had a lot of arguments about this with Susan Neiman, because obviously she's a philosopher, so she loves normativity. She has no problem with it, and kind of she kept accusing me of trying to sort of occupy a neutral academic position where I say normativity is bad and we should just analyze things. And that's not at all my position, actually. What I want to say is that, I mean, it would be ridiculous to deny that all of us in memory studies ultimately are in it because we also have strong feelings about the things that are being commemorated and how maybe they should be commemorated. But I found it simply extremely unproductive to formalize these expectations in a set of normative standards. So I've really developed a strong aversion to standards and toolkits and these kind of standardized models that the kind of parts 2, 3, and 4 of the typology refer to, because I find that they don't get us anywhere. The effect ends up being kind of increasing the standing of the person who's implementing the standards, but it's not really leading to any kind of progress in what we actually want to achieve. And I mean, if we had time, I could kind of tell a long story about my own development, because I put together an edited volume on war memory in Russian 16 years ago. And then I kind of went around doing presentations and being, quite gung-ho myself about, the great achievements of West German because it was mostly built also on a German-Russian comparison. And then I was really put to shame in some of these events by a completely non-academic audience, where it wasn't so much that they pointed out sort of empirical problems with the book, because there weren't that many, but they were visibly annoyed by the sort of moralizing tone that a lot of authors in the book employed, and felt that it completely dismissed their own experience as people who, for example, grew up in the Soviet Union and had a certain type of relationship with war memory. And that really put me on a path of many years of trying to really acknowledge the complexity of these different memories. And I think that ultimately that is the only way to advance in any way, on the basis of our own normative expectations. Because if we behave in these debates the way a lot of, let's say, liberals do in Russia, which is, constantly basically insulting everyone and saying, 95% of Russians are just morons who have, no moral compass and don't understand how things really should be done in civilized countries. And I'm almost not exaggerating here. Then that will not really kind of induce others to engage in the kind of commemoration that you're interested in. Whereas if we do what Margaret is doing in her project and what lots of other people are now doing, which is to study empirically the kind of complex and contradictory ways in which people actually engage with their past, that will put us in a better position to then say, well, look, but there's still a problem here. The way that you're doing this still kind of, doesn't acknowledge certain facets of the crimes of the Stalinist system, etc. But if we don't also put in the work that's necessary for that first step, I think that ultimately there's no point in what we're doing. That would be sort of my take on normativity. Going back to the first question about implicit parallels and memorial forms, I mean, I guess a lot of work has already been done on that under the heading of transnational memories and traveling memories and transnational agency in memory activism. There are quite a number of certainly edited volumes on that, and I guess I was aware of that when I was starting to work on this book, but I found just as other people did that this is very important to look at, but we shouldn't forget that a lot of these debates are still happening in very much national contexts, right? And a lot of the agency in debates about transitional justice, memory, commemoration, etc., are still framed by very strong, national institutions. And within those debates, references to other national contexts are still very important. So, even though there has, of course, been a growth of transnational activism, we shouldn't simply neglect this level that continues to exist. So that's why I think in the book we focused primarily on explicit comparisons and borrowings, and much less on the kinds of implicit parallels that you're talking about, not because they're not important, but because I think there's, those are two different things. And certainly Michael Rothberg, I mean, we first met, I think, after I had already started working on the initial idea for at least the Soviet chapter, and the idea of multidirectional memory certainly was very important to me. And I would say that when multidirectional memory works, as it does in some of the cases that he analyzes, then ideally it works kind of as a springboard, because people draw creative inspiration and come up with something new. But in this book, I was more interested in cases when it fails.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thanks. So I am conscious of the time. If anybody has a very short question, you are welcome to ask it. Wait a second to see if anybody raises their hands. Otherwise, I think we can end it. Oh, Mischa? Okay. Go ahead. Other Mischa Twitchin.
sorry, it just occurred to me, I wondered whether you wanted to say anything more about your sense of why Out of Context was considered inappropriate as a title for the book. Or maybe, maybe that's indiscreet.
I was never in touch directly with the series editor. We always communicated through someone at Palgrave. And at some point, I get this message, you know, I had assumed that that would be the title. And at some point I get this message that's forwarded to me saying, oh, I must have missed discussion of this. Memory out of context could mean anything. It doesn't really mean anything to me. So you need another title. And, you know, maybe, I don't remember for what reason, I didn't really feel like putting up a fight. I mean, I'm happy actually that at least I managed to get the cover that I wanted. Because for, you know, a lot of reasons that I never really understood, Palgrave is very particular about things like images used and like epigraphs, etc. And it was very difficult to actually get a cover that I thought really sort of embodied what we're talking about. But I do think that if we had used my preferred title, maybe the book would have gotten more attention because Replicating Atonement sounds maybe a little too complex to some people. Some people took issue with atonement rather than, you know, any number of other terms I could have used, repentance or politics of regret, etc. And also some people in the literary community misread this as saying something about the novel Atonement by Ian McEwan, which is not discussed at all.
Well, I think that is a perfect note on which to end this mass confusion. So, Anakin, I don't know if you want to say any words at the end, but we can all give Mischa another round of applause. Very quiet,
Yes,
or using
thanks.
the end. And thank you.
Thanks for having me.